Most people think of their homes as safe places, walls that protect, doors that lock, windows that shield from whatever lurks outside. But what happens when those very barriers fail? Tonight, we're diving into 3 real horror stories from people who survived home invasions. These aren't ghost tales or urban legends. They're chilling accounts that could happen to anyone, anywhere. Each story begins with something ordinary, a quiet night, a routine evening, a moment of solitude, then spirals into a nightmare where survival isn't guaranteed. As you listen, ask yourself, how would you react if a stranger forced their way into your private world? The first story comes from a young man who had just settled into his parents' guest bedroom after a long day at work. The house was empty, his parents away for the weekend, his brother out of town. Around midnight, he heard the garage door rattle open, shaking the floor above him. At first, he thought maybe someone came home early. But when he realized every family member was supposed to be gone, his stomach sank. Peering through the window, he saw only darkness and the yawning mouth of the open garage. His heart pounded with dread as he reached for an old baseball bat in the closet. Convinced someone else was inside creeping down the stairs, he tried to convince himself there was some harmless explanation. Maybe the garage opener malfunctioned. Maybe his parents had returned without warning. But when he heard muffled voices drifting from the bedrooms, the truth became undeniable. Intruders were inside. His instincts screamed to hide, yet another voice inside pushed him forward. He dialed 911 in a whisper, gave his address, and left the call open in his pocket. The operator begged him to stay put, but adrenaline took control. Bat in hand, he charged toward the voices, yelling to catch them off guard, ready to fight for his home despite the overwhelming danger awaiting in that hallway. 2 men stood in his parents' bedroom, rifling through drawers. Shock flashed across their faces when he burst in. Swinging the bat, he struck one in the leg, sending him sprawling. The second, larger man lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. The bat was ripped from his grip, and powerful hands clamped around his throat. Panic surged as his vision blurred, his lungs screaming for air. Crawling in the corner, the first intruder raised a knife, inching closer. In that moment, he realized this wasn't bravery, it was desperation, and he might not survive it. Just as consciousness began to fade, faint sirens pierced the night. A fragile thread of hope. The last thing he remembered was the man lifting the bat and swinging. Darkness consumed him. When his eyes opened again, a police officer knelt beside him, gently shaking his shoulder. Disoriented and aching, he realized the intruders had fled through the back door when they heard sirens. Paramedics checked him for injuries, urging a hospital visit, but he refused. Later, as he recounted the night to his shaken parents, one disturbing detail lingered. How had the men gotten in? The garage opener was inside his unlocked car, something only a family member or close acquaintance would know about. That detail transformed the fear into paranoia. Whoever broke in wasn't a stranger. They knew him. The second story belongs to a woman who had just moved into a small apartment after ending a long relationship. It was her first night alone in the new place. Boxes stacked in corners, furniture half assembled. Around 2 a.m., she was jolted awake by persistent knocking on her door. Groggy and confused, she called out, asking who it was. A man's voice answered, claiming to be from the building's maintenance staff. He said there was an emergency water leak that needed immediate fixing. Something about his tone unsettled her. It was too forceful, too impatient. She told him she would call the landlord first, but he kept knocking harder, insisting she let him inside. Her pulse quickened as she grabbed her phone and dialed the landlord, whispering about the stranger outside. The landlord's groggy response was chilling. There was no emergency, and no maintenance worker had been sent. Fear surged. She quietly slipped into the kitchen, clutching a knife with trembling hands. Suddenly, the knocks turned into violent pounding, the door frame rattling under the force. She bolted to her bedroom, locked the door, and pressed her ear against it. Silence. Then the sound of metal scraping at the lock, Someone was trying to pick it. She backed away, heart hammering, certain she was seconds from facing a man who wanted far more than to fix pipes. She dialed 911, her voice shaking as she whispered the situation. The operator urged her to stay calm, stay hidden, and keep the line open. The sound of the front door finally giving way echoed through the apartment like a thunderclap. Heavy footsteps moved cautiously down the hall, pausing outside her locked bedroom door. She pressed her back against the closet, stifling sobs, knife still clutched in her hand. Suddenly, the man's voice came again, quieter now, mocking, almost playful. He promised he wasn't there to hurt her, just to talk. The knob rattled violently, the lock groaned, and she braced herself for the worst moment of her life. Just as the lock began to splinter, red and blue lights flashed through the curtains. A commanding voice boomed from the hallway, "Police." The intruder bolted, footsteps thundering toward the living room. She heard glass shatter as he smashed through a window to escape. Moments later, officers filled her apartment, weapons drawn, securing each room before helping her from the closet. Shaking uncontrollably, she explained what had happened, but the man was never caught. For weeks afterward, sleep was impossible. Every knock on her door sent her spiraling into panic. She realized the invasion wasn't just of her home, it was of her sense of safety, something she'd never fully reclaim again. The third story comes from an older couple living in a quiet suburban neighborhood. They had been married for decades, enjoying retirement in the same home they'd raised their children. One summer night, around 3 a.m., they awoke to the sound of shattering glass downstairs. At first, they thought it was a fallen picture frame, but when they heard hurried footsteps and whispered voices, terror set in. The husband reached for the phone while his wife clutched his arm, begging him not to go down. But he refused to sit idly by. Grabbing the old revolver he kept locked away, he crept toward the stairs, every board creaking beneath his weight. At the base of the stairs, he spotted two shadowy figures moving through the kitchen, stuffing valuables into backpacks. He raised the revolver, voice steady despite the terror shaking his chest, and demanded they leave. One intruder froze, but the other snarled and charged forward, brandishing a crowbar. A shot rang out, deafening in the confined space. The man collapsed to the floor, clutching his leg, screaming in rage. The second burglar fled instantly, bolting through the shattered window they had entered from. Trembling, the husband called out to his wife, assuring her it was over. But the sound of police sirens approaching told him the nightmare had only begun. The injured intruder survived, later confessing he and his partner had targeted the couple after watching their routines for weeks. Though the husband was never charged, the incident weighed heavily on both him and his wife. Their home, once filled with memories, now felt scarred by violence. These three stories remind us that danger often hides where we feel safest. Sometimes survival isn't about bravery, but about the terrifying choices we make when forced to defend everything we love.